Hello and welcome to the Royal United Services Institute here in London to another session of mapping the pandemic, the way we look at the long-term implications of the current coronavirus pandemic around the world. We looked at Europe, we looked at the Middle East, but now we're coming home to the home of the Royal United Services Institute, to the UK. And we're looking at what the pandemic ultimately means for the defense and security posture of the UK, for the kind of priorities that are likely to face us and the kind of choices, geopolitical and finance choices that our politicians will have to make in the future. I'm joined by two very distinguished participants. The first is Professor Malcolm Chalmers, our Deputy Director General here at the Institute. And the other one is Professor Beatrice Heuser, the Professor of Politics at Glasgow University, both of whom will be making a short presentation of their position at the moment, to be followed thereafter by your questions. I see we are joined around the world from over 200 people at the moment. My only request to you is please keep the questions coming in after the presentations. We will have a good period of time for the discussion. So do keep the questions coming in. Use the function at the bottom of your app, the button that says Q&A, and fire off the questions. I already see two questions even before it began. But let me turn to my colleague here at the Institute, Professor Chalmers, for his first introduction.
For joining us on this webinar. Some of you may have listened to Secretary of State Ben Wallace yesterday giving evidence to the House of Commons Defence Committee, and it was not entirely clear from his presentation whether the timing of the next integrated review and comprehensive spending review had yet been decided. That his answers on that question were a little vague, but I think it is clear to me that by far the most likely option is that both those reviews, which were due to be completed this summer, will be postponed at least until 2021 and probably well into 2021. The downside of that emerging decision will be another year, of course, of uncertainty in relation to UK foreign defence and security policy. But I would suggest that there are at least four upsides to that postponement. The first is that it will give the government time to do those reviews properly. Right now, the central government machinery is so overwhelmed by the pandemic, and indeed we can see every day the results of their lack of ability to handle the multiple demands on them. That would be quite difficult to do anything like the deep review that is required. It's simply impractical to have such a review anytime soon. But secondly, we have the US presidential election in November, and the outcome of that election will, I think, have important implications for international geopolitics. Certainly a second term of a Trump administration pursuing the approach that he has been pursuing in recent years would have profound implications, I think, for the UK's integrated review on security and especially defence policy. Third, by next year, most likely the Brexit transition period will be over, certainly if the government sticks to its current policy, and we will know within a month or so whether indeed they do so, but I think that's still likely. And by next summer, we will be fully out of the single market and customs union with an independent immigration policy and so on, with all that entails for our foreign policy. But above all, fourthly, and that's the main focus of this session, it will allow account to be taken of the impact of the coronavirus crisis, and those impacts are likely to be profound. The four major reviews of the post-Cold War period, four major defense reviews, 1990, 1998, and the two SDSRs in the last decade, it all focus both on the resourcing of defense and security on one hand, and the priorities within that resource envelope on the other. And although it's too early to make a full prognosis, clearly, I think there's already a case to be made that at this moment, these years, with the pandemic crisis, but also other international trends, will be as profound a turning point in international relations as any of those. For certainly it's shaping up to have a much deeper and more global impact than the crisis of 2014, the Russian aggression in Ukraine. It's bigger, I think, shaping up to be bigger than 9/11 in terms of its global impact, which had such profound impact on defense and security policies for the decade thereafter, the war on terror, the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. And even, I think, comparable in many ways to the end of the Cold War. That's certainly maybe too early to say whether that's the case, but it feels like it's of that magnitude, a shock. We will never be the same again after this crisis. And that's partly because in some respects, this crisis represents a deep discontinuity. I think especially in the developing world, after a period of decades in which slow but important progress was made in human development across much of Africa, South Asia, the Middle East even, the pandemic is only beginning to have an impact on those societies. But I think the potential impact directly through health, but even more profoundly in terms of economics, deeply hitting oil producers, commodity exporters more generally, and indeed those countries relying on tourism, a profound setback, I think, to human welfare across much of the developing world, with knock-on effects on political stability and migration and lots of other international security phenomena we worry about. But in other ways, I think the pandemic seems likely to reinforce, be a force multiplier, if you like, for the resurgence of nationalism across many of the major and medium powers of the world, which already is an identifiable trend. I talked about that in a paper I published earlier this year, and a nationalisms which are increasingly interacting with each other in unpredictable and potentially dangerous ways. And that's involved in part a reordering of international relationships between major powers, a lot of focus, of course, on the US-China relationship being affected by this crisis. It's impacting on relations between European powers, with lots of questions being raised about the future of the Eurozone. And it's really striking, of course, the way in which the US reaction to this crisis has been very different from its reaction to the crisis in 1990 and 2001 in its relations with its allies. So some of the most profound questions for the UK in the integrated review when it comes will be whether we can go back to the old days in terms of the West as a cohesive international entity or not. And that geopolitical return to nationalism, on the one hand, is interacting with the trend towards deglobalization, deregulation, or removal of international regulation, going back to the nation state. One of the most dramatic aspects of this crisis is a way in which, in an almost biblical sense, everybody's going back home. Across the world, people are going back to their hometowns, their home countries. The nation state is the source of security, what security we have in this crisis for so many millions across the world. That's a really striking phenomenon in a world which previously we would have defined as characterized by globalization. But one of the paradoxes of this moment is, for all that nationalism, for all the differences in systems between dictatorship and liberal democracy and so on, I suspect that the longer this crisis goes on, the more likely that the virus itself will force us to converge in our approaches. We're trying all sorts of different approaches across the world, but there will, I think, be quite a significant convergence on what works, whether it's testing, tracking, quarantining. If countries have a successful formula, even if it raises questions about civil liberties and so on, the survival of peoples and economies, it will depend on getting that right. So I think we're going to be learning a lot from each other. So that brings me to the integrated review and the comprehensive spending review whenever they come. In a paper I published, I think, with Will Jessett, not much more than a month ago, just as this crisis was emerging, we argued that the central scenario for defence spending for the UK is that the extra 2 billion which the Treasury provided to the MOD last year in the spending round would be consolidated into the MOD's baseline, which is worth about 20 billion pounds over a decade. And on top of that, the MOD would get real terms increases of 0.5% per annum. And we came up with recommendations for capabilities based on that central assumption. That now feels very much like a best case for defence spending, given the depths of the economic recession the UK is facing, but also the many competing pressures on the public purse. Even if the government is prepared to raise taxes specifically for increased spending on health and social care, there are multiple other demands for funding higher levels of unemployment, investing in the north, the more deprived areas of the country, saving our bankrupt universities, and so on and so forth. So if defence and security are to make a case for maintaining their current level of resources in this very difficult environment, they're going to have to be seen to be relevant to the key security questions facing that integrated reviews, facing that the country over the next year. And first of all, I think that means being seen as relevant to the ongoing coronavirus pandemic, and indeed the future, the risk of future pandemics. As I think we all know, and we're seeing very graphically today, the identification of a global pandemic as a tier 1 security risk. For the last decade, successive security reviews have this up and light. This is not unknown. This is not a black swan event. It was very, very predictable in its broad contours, but it simply wasn't translated into an operational priority, a budgetary priority for the core security brokers, the Treasury, the Cabinet Office in our state. And today, some will argue, I've heard people argue, that combating that threat, the current pandemic, but also possible future pandemics, is a security, it will be a priority, comparable to the war on terrorists after 9/11 or containment of the Soviet Union. And in some ways, that's a very misleading comparison, of course. But in terms of what matters to British people, not simply in terms of budgets, but in terms of a whole range of policies in areas as different as industrial policy or the use of big data by the state, it is going to be something people want answers to in that review. Secondly, so beyond the pandemic, I think it's also going to focus attention in the integrated review on a range of other threats to UK security at home on the national resilience agenda, if you like, whether it's cyber attacks, disinformation, espionage, whether it's organized by states or organized non-state actors, or indeed rogue individuals, conspiracy theorists, most obviously in relation to a pandemic. And after 9/11, the government did absorb the importance of countering terrorism at home and put a lot of resource into that, a lot of thinking into that. But what it didn't do is follow through in resilience more broadly. Even as we increase spending and focus on countering terrorism, we cut resources for dealing with organized crime. Police numbers went down by 20,000. The justice system more generally was cut back. And not least, of course, there was a lack of investment in pandemic preparation. So finally, maybe if I could, Jonathan, just a couple of remarks on what this might mean for the military specifically. First of all, I think it means for the military a different way of thinking. National resilience can no longer be seen as residual, to be done with resources which are not needed for now for the core missions of power projection. It has to be, national resilience has to be front and center, not necessarily taking up most resources. I don't think that will be the case, but something which is an irreducible central element of our defense posture. Secondly, I think we shouldn't understate the importance of the military's involvement in this crisis as it develops, and it's only, I think, just beginning. Not so much the matter of numbers, the 20,000 standby force, which I think it's unlikely all of that will be mobilized except in the very dire circumstances. Rather, it's the 1,000 military planners who are now in place across almost every arm of government, national and local, regional government, dealing with the Scottish, Welsh, Northern Irish assemblies or parliaments, helping hospitals to get PPE, helping set up test centres across the country, using their expertise to introduce big data practices developed for military purposes and deploying them for civilian purposes, helping to counter disinformation. And in the process, the military is learning a lot about our society's resilience and our lack of resilience, what's going wrong, what's working well. And the military is not going to be the main remedy going forward, but they're building up really a wealth of expertise. So in the integrated review, I hope the MOD is forward-leaning, deploying what they're learning as part of an all-government effort to make sure we're much better prepared for future threats to national resilience. I have much more to say, but perhaps we can come back to that in Q&A. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Malcolm. And let us turn directly to Glasgow and to Professor Heuser. Professor Heuser, you recently authored a paper which sort of indicated fairly grim choices facing us, at least in economic terms. But I wonder if you could broaden them up as to where you see the implications.
Thank you very much. And I must also thank right away my University of Glasgow ad hoc response team, which was made up of a number of colleagues, but also excellent students that we had, who all chipped in at very, very short notice to bring their expertise on economic factors, but also on Russia, on China, and on various countries in the European Union to a joint report that we worked out, and that is now online with Coriolis Technologies. And I'd just like to, it's in three sections, comment on what we came up with. I think it is very difficult to put it all together and to lump all the analysis together into one period. And therefore, I'd like to cut it into three different sections, starting with immediate effects, then the effects after a vaccine will have been found, hopefully, and then the slightly more long-term effects for the later 2020s. So to start with the immediate effects, I would like to endorse immediately what Malcolm Chalmers just said about the importance of the military work that has been done in the context of the crisis, with helping transporting patients, equipment, helping planning and various other things. At the same time, we already noticed that the military themselves are, of course, vulnerable to the virus. So there is a US and a French aircraft carrier each that have been infected with and had to, with so many people being ill that they had to abort their mission. In Russia, the 9th of May, a parade has been postponed, and it seems that the call up for this season's conscripts may be delayed. China is probably also preoccupied with itself, probably facing the same problems with the virus with regarding to its navy and its other military. I hope we can work out from that there is not going to be, no military in the world currently is very tempted to go on adventures of any sorts that would be detrimental to our security. Now, turning to the United States, the question has already been raised by Malcolm Chalmers, whether the handling of this crisis will lead to Donald Trump being voted out of office in November. That is very much an open question and very much depends on that, of course, for the future. Another open question is whether we can get through the months or the year or more before a vaccine becomes available without another or possibly several further lockdowns, which would again have enormous impact on our economy and our productivity. And even without the lockdowns, we know that this is having catastrophic effects on the UK, gastronomy, hospitality, tourist industry, and other industries, probably the university sector. I've had a very distressing comment on our report recently when somebody asked, well, what makes you so sure that a vaccine will be found? Because our entire report was working off the Imperial College work and the work of the Sorbonne University in Paris and the Leopoldina in Berlin. And they all assumed that a vaccine would be found within the next 12 to 18 months, or now 11 to 17 months. I was wondering whether anybody in the audience could comment on that, whether there is serious cause to fear that a vaccine might not be found, invented, and because that would be horrendous, of course. Looking at the effects of the crisis once a vaccine has been found, so by the end of the crisis, the economic losses and the government budget deficits that are expected will most likely exceed anything that we've seen since the Second World War, perhaps since the First World War. So this is going to be worse than the crisis after the 2008 subprime financial crisis. So that's very bad news indeed, which also means that austerity measures and budget cuts will be inevitable. The budget cuts will be made, at least in the West, wherever possible, including, of course, in defense procurement, recruitment, and retention, wherever you can change something. You can't cut the pensions of people who are already in the system or are out of the system, but the things that you can change in the budget will be putting off defense procurement, trying to extend dates for that, and new recruitment, and then retention, where people only have contracts to serve for a certain period of time. This is likely to apply also to the United States. It may not apply to the same extent to China and other Far Eastern countries, which have managed to contain the virus and the economic damage, mostly with more draconian lockdown measures. But that's, again, a guess, because at the moment, what we suspect is that Chinese figures aren't adding up, but at least we think that there's the Chinese economy as a whole has already shown some damage, but perhaps not as much as the Western countries will experience. The European countries, including the UK, I think are going to be cooking their books like hell in order to keep their 2% promise on defense spending made to NATO and the US. I don't believe that they can really keep up that promise. In matters of defense, all Europeans have, of course, in the past and since the Second World War, relied on other countries as force multipliers, especially on the United States, but of course also on the UK through NATO. And no European country with the debts that will be there after the crisis will be very keen to change that, and particularly not fast. The big question which decides what happens to the European Union in the next 10 years is now whether the richer countries will give enough aid to the poorer countries, for the poorer countries in the EU to gain faith, to regain faith in the EU, because at the moment we see that that is at rock bottom. And this crisis is therefore seen by many, including Macron, as fateful for the future of the European Union. Will it muddle through and then wither away? Or will people see the light that they really need to work together more and need to share more and make sacrifices for each other so that the Union will emerge strengthened from this? Russia, turning to Russia, the simultaneous oil price problem, which is unlikely to go away during the crisis with less use of fuel for transport, is already weakening the Russian economy. And the question is, what options does Putin then have to show that Russia is a world power? Will he be tempted to use the military for foreign adventures simply because that's the only thing that a strong man can do in order to show that he's strong? The challenge here is for us whether we can convince Russia during the crisis, while the crisis is on, that we are all in this together and to make Putin become more of a peaceful team player. And this would be a fantastic thing to achieve, and it would be something that is definitely worth trying if at all possible. Meanwhile, the developing world will be left with disastrous levels of unemployment and poverty, with social unrest, and with mass economic migration again towards Europe. The Daily Mail today has spoken about a new Battle of Hastings with immigrants arriving on British shores. I hope that in the future, the task of the British military will not be to prevent them from landing by the use of force. Will the UK government see the light on this and join forces with the EU to large this much larger problem on a global basis and jointly, and so as to keep immigration not only away from Hastings and the White Cliffs of Dover, but already from the European Union by addressing the problems there at source. Finally, effects by the end of 2020. These entirely, of course, depend on which tracks we are set on by the end of the crisis. And so the first two stages that I've discussed all the question marks there have to be answers before you can really tackle what the longer term effects are. And many of the big decisions that will be made in the meantime will determine what possible scenarios you can imagine for the longer term future after 2022, 2025 or thereabouts. How will relations with Russia have evolved them, and therefore quite a spectrum of different scenarios is possible. And to stay with the pretty likely there, the pretty likely elements in the scenario are that there will be less money for defense throughout the 1920s than there had been before 2008, that procurement will be delayed if at all possible, that among Britain's closest allies, NATO allies, only the US and France will be both willing and capable of fielding substantial forces, which is a continuation of what we've known since the 1950s. That smaller countries, Canada, the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, will continue to look for the UK for leadership if the UK can provide it in defense contexts. But in the light of the dire straits of public spending, the isolationist voices in the United States and the UK are likely to grow in number. Remember that that was a part also of the Brexiteer electorate who were for some sort of isolationism and withdrawal from commitments to Europe. They will say, why spend money on military operations or aid, indeed, foreign aid abroad if we need it so badly at home? And we can only keep our fingers crossed that Russia and China will not take advantage of this weakness of the West at that stage. Thank you very much. Jonathan?
Thank you very much, Professor Heuser. Let me just come directly to the first question. We, of course, had quite a number of questions from the audience. And this one comes from Professor Schimmelfenning from the Ruhr University in Germany, who's asking exactly the point on which you concluded, which is the NHS seems to be the winner in this particular health emergency for very obvious reasons. Are we still willing, would the British electorate still be willing to come good on its promises on the security guarantees offered through NATO membership to vulnerable countries such as the Baltic states if the chips are down? We're all guessing here, but what is your feel?
Shall I go? This is, of course, a question again of what's happening, in what time frame we're talking. At the moment, as we all know, the United Kingdom has been very forward-leaning in this, but also France has deployed forces in the Baltic states, although a relatively small scale, and constantly thinking about reinforcements, etc. In a way, this is linked to the overall tradition that the United Kingdom has had since the beginning of the Cold War, which was to have this continental commitment and to have a forward deployment of forces and to be willing to use its own nuclear forces, even as a deterrence umbrella for Central European forces. So if anybody's likely to do it within NATO and within NATO Europe, it's going to be the United Kingdom. How this happens in the longer period of time, we will see what happens, what a degree of solidarity emerges in the longer term future. Thank you, Johnson.
Thank you, Beatrice. Malcolm?
Yes, it's a very good question. I think clearly the public spending pressure on the is going to be very considerable. I can't see a scenario in which taxation is not increased, and indeed there's more spending for health and social care. So the defense budget is going to be under quite a bit of pressure. But I don't think there's an automatic link between that and the UK's security commitment to its European allies. I think a lot actually in this calculus will depend on the United States and where the US goes after the next presidential election, and how far Europeans feel the American security guarantee is still valid or not. But one of the things I argued in the paper I published just a few weeks ago is that the UK should put more emphasis on thinking about scenarios, maybe less than total war scenarios, but kinetic scenarios, in which it might have to confront Russia or indeed others in the European neighborhood without the US being fully committed. And I think what that means in practice is the UK has to cooperate more, not less, with its European neighbours, particularly in Northern Europe and Scandinavia. And that's what the UK is doing. And the UK's got, I think, the biggest presence of all the European powers in the Baltic republics, very active in air defence, Royal Marines particularly, but other parts of the service, also close relationships with Norway and others. So the UK is pretty forward-leaning in this area. I don't think any of that will change. Indeed, in many ways, it will be a growing priority. What I think the UK, however, should be doing is reaching out to its main European neighbours and say, look, we do have to think about taking more responsibility for our own defence as Europeans. The UK is willing to do its bit, but the UK can't be the leader across the whole European defence efforts. Others, Germany most of all perhaps, which has increased its defence budget, needs to take more of a lead in some aspects of that so we can work together and have a cohesive, integrated European approach. And let's move away from the rather sterile argument about architecture and the relative role of the EU and NATO and so on, and focus on providing European capabilities that can actually deter.
Thank you, Malcolm. Since I have you, let me turn to a batch of questions about the impact of the health crisis on the entire sort of procurement ethos of the government. We have a question from William Hocking, who is saying that, the highlighted shortfalls in acquisition policies that we've seen in Britain as a result of the pandemic, doesn't it put a big question mark over the whole just-in-time procurement strategy of the MOD? Peter Hudson is asking whether this crisis does not require perhaps a fundamental rethink of our entire defense industrial strategy. And finally, Mike Gapes, known to you, a long-standing parliamentarian, is asking whether the one fundamental logistical lesson from this crisis, namely the question of stockpiling, strategic stockpiles of a variety of things, is not one that will need to be absorbed and will absorb quite a lot of cash from a future defense department. Quite disparate, but all concentrating on the logistical procurement side. Malcolm?
Well, maybe I can start it, and maybe Beatrice would want to come in on some aspects where I don't have a good answer. Look, on the question on stockpiling and national self-sufficiency and so on, I think we've got to have is a really good question. There are, of course, dangers in moving towards too great a degree of self-sufficiency. If that's too expensive, what we do want to avoid is dependence on a small number of unreliable external suppliers, and particularly on those external suppliers who might use that dependence as a way of exerting leverage on that. But that depends on what the particular good is. A lot of with PPE, for example, as I understand it, a lot of the issues are just about the sheer number of middlemen who are coming into the picture, offering their services and so on, and central government simply being overwhelmed by that. So that suggests we should certainly look at procurement in this area. Whether it means we have to have much bigger stockpiles, I think, is a question which is a question of detail, which can't be answered as a general point. But it does overlap the wider international trend towards moving a bit more away from globalization, putting more focus on national effort, which I think is right, that international cooperation is very important. We can gain a lot for that, but I think the international cooperation is not a good in itself. It's a means to an end of pursuing our own security and prosperity, and sometimes we don't always remember that. Peter Hudson, rethink defense industrial strategy. Yes, but I was very struck by Rich Knighton's answer at the Defence Committee yesterday, where he reminded Marc Francois about the number of defense industrial strategy reviews we've had over the last 30 years. I think it was more than a dozen, as I recall, and they often come back with a pretty similar diagnosis. I think we know what the diagnosis is. The harder issue is what the response is. And I'm not holding my breath that this is the magic bullet for solving some of the problems we have. We have some real problems about prioritization, and we have to address those directly, not think that there is some magical way in which we can get much more efficient. The most obvious trade-off, I think, is, are we prepared to have less military capability, lower quality kit, maybe delivered later, in order to pursue a robust national defense industry which has other advantages, economic and security? It's hard to get both. We've gone through a phase, I think, where we've bought quite a lot of American kit because that's what the services have been demanding, very, very understandably. But it may be that that dial needs to be shifted a little bit more in the other direction.
Beatrice?
Just very briefly, one of the things we've learned, alas, is that stockpiling very often leads you to having old equipment that all of a sudden is no longer good. For example, France ran into the problem that with a similar review somewhere in the early 2010s, they came to the conclusion that yes, an epidemic is a terrible possibility. They bought lots and lots of masks. Turns out the masks have all gone off by now. So stockpiling alone is a big investment that has to be renewed, and that's of course true as much for any missiles that are under wraps, or any metal gear that is under wraps. And all of a sudden, it turns out that several years later, it is no longer in the condition in which it was put under wraps, however well you're trying to preserve it. So stockpiling itself is an expensive business. Thank you.
Since I have you, I wonder if I could ask a direct question. That came from Rory Sword in London, one of our members. You put a very internationalist agenda. You still assume that at the end of this crisis, the UK should remain should sort of adhere to an internationalist agenda. But how about the argument that the DFID budget, the overseas aid budget, should not be exempt from any cuts? It's 0.7% of GDP, quite a hefty amount in a difficult period.
My own reaction to that would, of course, be that it must be exempt from cuts, because that's where the crisis is going to hit worst in the near future. I mean, it is going to be absolutely devastating for not only all countries with a tourist industry, but also countries that have producing cheaper consumer goods for us, which we'll no longer import. And the more we're going the way which Malcolm described, which is to take it back to take our own consumption closer to home and make sure that we have a diversification of supplies and things like that, the more that is going to eliminate suppliers that are far away and that are possibly politically dicey because there's social unrest there because of the high unemployment and things like that. So I think if we don't want to be absolutely contributing to what I foresee as a particular horror of the crisis itself and the post-crisis period in particularly Africa, but also parts of Asia, probably Latin America, we need to keep that up, and that'll be in our long-term interest. The problem is always how to justify this to a larger electorate, because all economic aid is always posited on the assumption of terrible things will happen unless we give this. At this stage, we can still do it, but it's always much more difficult to prove that these terrible things would happen if we didn't give the aid than it is to have a crisis on hand that is already in flames and burning, and then to say we need to send forces because it's clearly and evidently there. Which brings me to another point, if I may just relate it to that. The British government successively have now prided themselves for quite a while on Britain being a low tax country. I think the whole issue of how badly under-equipped and underfunded the NHS has been coming into this crisis, with the reduction of hospital beds overall since the beginning of the 2000s, shows itself up as something that is unsustainable. If we want to have an NHS, we must increase taxes. If we want to have security, we must increase taxes. And I think it's an absolute madness to think that you can pursue low taxes in an economy which is going to have so many unemployed when we have to try to bail out. Those are our values. That's our essential approach to deal with to our fellow human beings who are worse off. And it has to apply to the NHS as well. So I think that's one of the things that we really have to see as an impossible to get around. We have to increase taxes and we have to share the burden of this jointly.
Of course, Malcolm also raised the question of an increased tax burden, but are you really saying that in these glorious days when we are now out of the European Union and supposedly regaining our competitiveness, we should try to damage this competitiveness by becoming a high tax state?
I don't think it's damaging our competitiveness if we are ensuring that our society is stable and that the people in our society who will otherwise go onto the streets and will have no alternative to an uprising or are organizing themselves in very, very active trade unions again or something like that, will be somehow protected from the outcome of this crisis. If you take the entire hospitality sector and you take the entire gastronomy sector and tourist industry together, the number of people we're dealing with who are being pushed currently over the edge and who cannot be supported unless we all join forces in this is tremendous. So think about it in terms of the simple solidarity of the society surviving, I'd say.
Thank you. Let me turn to Malcolm. One of the disadvantages of having a long publication record in this field is that people can quote things back at you. So here's one from Sir David Logan from the ex-Foreign Office, who says that in the past, in previous analyses that you have done, you criticized too much of an excessive focus on hybrid threats. And at the expense of the generation of hard power. Would you change your view now, given what has happened with the coronavirus? Or would you still say that in purely military term, chasing all kinds of potential hybrid threats and what we could do about it is not the best approach?
Well, I think you have to distinguish between the balance of our total effort and the balance of our incremental effort, as it were. And I think one of the results of the significant NATO rearmament since 2014, every NATO country has increased its defense budget. We're thinking a lot more about Russia than we did at that time in NATO. Is that quite a significant part of the conventional gap, the potential opportunities which Russia had at an operational military level in Europe have been closed and continue to be being closed. And I suspect as Russia responds in budgetary terms to the coronavirus itself and cutting its own military capability, that those opportunities will lessen further. But as a series of events have shown recently, there remain a whole series of other potential threats, which aren't primarily about force on force, conventional force on force, but hybrid is a horrible term, really. But if we're talking about cyber, espionage, subversion, information warfare, etc., and also sometimes the limited use of force in ways which is designed to be below the threshold of major conventional war. That feels to me a range of threats which we will continue to be concerned about in relation to Russia, in relation to China, in relation potentially to a range of others. So in terms of incremental investment of resources, I think there is a case for doing more in that space. We're already doing more. But that doesn't mean that that's the main focus of the whole defense and security effort, the vast bulk of which will continue to be about maintaining that conventional deterrence.
Thank you. Let me turn to a few questions that were put to us about the role of the armed forces in society. Ewan Grant, a member of the Institute, is asking us, how much will the role change of the armed forces in society as a result of this pandemic? And we've got another question from Major Houston, who's asking us, would it not be a case that we could from now on treat the military not as an asset of last resort in these kind of a crisis, but as an asset of first resort, or as one of the first responders in a civil contingency situation? Malcolm, would you like to start on that?
Yes, very happy to do so. I think it's actually too early to provide a definitive answer to that question. I think what I prefer to do is, say we're learning so much, we will continue to learn so much of this crisis, which is still at an early stage. Those of us who think we're all going to be back in our offices, back to normal in a couple of months' time, I think will be sadly mistaken. We're going to have a long period where we're thinking about how to bring up testing, quarantining, everything else, tracking people, which is going to require a lot of innovation in government, in the private sector over the next year. And the military is engaged across that wide range of issues, helping a government which in many civilian sectors is deeply depleted in its planning capability. The military is helping, quite rightly, in a very pragmatic way in every region of our country, in the devolved administrations as much as with central government and so on. So the military, the MOD should be part of that conversation, not to get the armed forces a bigger share of the pie in terms of the response. Who is best placed for that response is something which should come out pragmatically, but nor I think should we be stuck in this model that there's something dangerous about using the military domestically, and it should only be for major terrorist offences, as we saw in Northern Ireland, or deploying overseas. I think that's also quite old-fashioned. Let's just be pragmatic about this. This is a major national emergency. The armed forces are playing an important role in responding to it, and they should play an important role in helping us think imaginatively about how to go forward from here. But what we shouldn't do is have a mentality in our thinking in the military that they just want to get back to normal business. That's also the wrong way to think about this. If that's the mentality, then quite rightly the military will be left behind as we think about resourcing priorities.
Beatrice?
Yes, could I just add to that? Historically seen, I have a member of my team, Jack Harding, who's working on this particularly. There's been a great reluctance over quite a long time about using the military domestically in emergency situations. For the older ones among us, Peterloo, 1818, the massacre of Peterfield near Manchester, where armed forces were used to fight down a peaceful protest, was rankling high. And there was sort of centuries since the English Civil War saying, oh, we don't want to have our armed forces doing anything in our own soil. A similar situation existed in France, a similar situation still exists in Germany, where there's a taboo about using the armed forces. But in fact, that has waned very considerably over the last few years, particularly, as Malcolm already mentioned, in the context of fighting terrorism. And in France, the military is now used much more extensively than in the UK. And my young colleague, Jack Harding, has found that there's much less resistance against this in the British public than there used to be. In fact, many people don't even know that there's ever been a taboo around this. So from that point of view, we can contribute the information or the study that I think there's much more scope now to use the military, if necessary, in an urgent situation than before. What I would like to warn against is to say that the military should be seen as something that can always pick up the pieces. In general, I think we should plan to make do without it. This should be in case of urgencies, extreme crises like the current one. I don't see anything wrong with that. But we shouldn't think of the military as the organization we draw on if we can't cope in our normal planning or if we're deficient in our normal planning. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you. Let me turn now to a sort of straightforward strategic questions about Britain's posture. Both of you did not mention India, and Michael Clark, our former Director General, was asking whether we have a view of India being rather exposed to the possibilities of, or to the dangers of the current epidemic, whether there is whether the panelists have a view on that. Also, we had a stream of questions, one from Paul Howe, the other one from Andy Nethaway, both asking, do we need to revise our policies towards Russia and China as a result of the current health crisis? Let me start with Beatrice.
Sorry, can I just pass on that? Because India is one thing I don't know anything about other than what I've learned from people like Michael Clark himself.
So in terms of, for instance, Russia and China, given some of the lessons that we have from the Chinese behavior, would you like to take that on?
Yeah, well, one of the things that I find, the impression I get is that that is a bit of a marriage of convenience, and that both countries are happy to keep each other's backs free by a certain amount of cooperation. I think that will survive the crisis. I think that is likely to, that relationship is likely to survive the crisis. But I'm a particular fan of watching military exercises. And one of the interesting things about the military exercise, big military exercise conducted last year between Russia and China, that was very publicly shown as an event that brought the two militaries together. If you looked at it closely, there was very little exchange of information, and the various units were kept well separated. So I think it is very much a marriage of convenience, and if it came under strain, all sorts of things could go wrong. But for the moment, it is something of a concern for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Malcolm. India, Russia, China, all ripe for a second look as far as Britain is concerned?
India, Russia, China, all in 1 minute, Jonathan. Of course, that's not a problem. The way in which this pandemic has spread, it started in the developed world and in China, which in many respects is also part of the developed world today. So the impact on other parts of the world is only just being felt. And all the stories about this is a disease which doesn't affect people living in hot climates and so on, I suspect will not be the case, but who knows? But it is certainly a very plausible scenario that, given the difficulty of governments in countries where very large parts of the population live in overcrowded and unsanitary conditions, that within a few weeks of today, the rates of prevalence of this virus in countries like India and Nigeria and Brazil and others will be much higher than they are in East Asia or Europe, or indeed even in the United States. If the US is having problems in getting healthcare to its whole population, how much more is that a problem in countries like India? So we could have a situation in which the pandemic spreads. We get 40, 50, 60% of the population of countries in India having been exposed to this virus. And that will have profound impact on the politics, on the welfare of people in those countries. And it will also have profound impact on the extent to which others seek to quarantine those states from themselves. Imagine the impact in the UK if we, over the next few weeks, stop travel from the Indian subcontinent to the UK and vice versa, given the fact that millions of our own citizens have close links to relatives in those places, just to take one example, and there are many other examples. So I think we're just at the beginning of that process, but I think it will be one of the most profound impacts of this. And it's partly, of course, about the overseas aid agenda, which Beatrice mentioned, but I think we shouldn't over-focus on that. That's the immediate budgetary impact on the UK, but there's a much broader set of issues in a world where, at least for some time, there will be a very major setback to development in a whole range of developing countries. And in relation to China and Russia, well, in a way, one of the things about this pandemic is it's affecting all of us. We're all weakened. Gideon Rachman had us think something in the FT a couple of weeks ago, which I thought was right, that we're not living in a world in which the mantle of leading superpowers being passed from the US to China. We're in a world where we've got two weak superpowers, both in their different ways overextending. I think China, in many regards, is overextending with Belt of Roads. And some of the big questions, I think, in relation to China are whether this pandemic will expose that overextension. Now, there is a scenario in which China, an enlightened Chinese leadership, uses the vacuum the US is leaving in many parts of the world to establish itself as an indispensable ally. It hasn't done that yet. It's maladroit and primarily focused on its own domestic political problems in a way in which it's rolling out its propaganda and its economic aid. But that may change. That may change. Russia is particularly badly affected. Of all those three major powers, actually, particularly badly affected by this crisis because it's so reliant on oil and gas exports, and those are being absolutely hammered. I understand now Putin is asking the oligarchs to make their own financial contributions to the welfare of the people under their aegis. But I would have thought one potential scenario from this is a greatly weakened Russia, which may not necessarily be in our interest, but I think it's a real problem. So three overextended major powers, and India, always the major power of the future, but I think significantly weakened in the short term.
Can I add to that the question from Martin Doherty, an MP, about what the current health crisis will do to Britain's commitment to Europe?
Beatrice?
Malcolm, you were going to take that.
Was I? Okay.
Yes.
Well, the UK is a European power. We're going to continue to have a whole range of links to Europe. I think that there's the very technical but very important question as to whether the UK will be prepared to accept an extension of the transition period in the Brexit negotiations. And you probably know as well as I do, Martin, whether that's likely or not, but it doesn't seem to me likely that will be extended, and we will fully leave the European Union as a result at the end of December, but we will remain a European power. Our security, our economy will depend on our relationships with our European neighbours. So we'll find another way to cooperate, which some may find less attractive, but it will be on a different basis, and one based more on national sovereignty than the current one. So on European security, I think the UK has a fundamental interest in European countries cooperating with each other on security, and particularly our neighbours. Through the centuries, external threats self-evidently have come from our neighbours, and we're in a good position in security terms today because all our neighbours are friends and indeed allies. So if we can maintain that must be a good thing. And I don't think there's anybody serious in the British political spectrum who argues otherwise. So I think that's pretty self-evident. But there is clearly an issue in relation to the viability of European monetary union. It's not a new issue, but one of my fears is that the coronavirus will deepen the trend towards nationalism and disintegration of multilateral economic cooperation, which was already evident. That we should never predict too confidently, but there's clearly a strain there, and we certainly can't continue business as usual in terms of the very evident strains between members of the Eurozone at present.
Thank you. The last question, unfortunately, from a welter of questions that we got, I think best articulated by Ian Bond from the Centre for European Reform, who asked what will have to give in terms of Britain's capabilities, assuming the constraint on public finances, assuming all the impact on the economy that Beatrice outlined. What capabilities do you think Britain will be forced to shed or should shed? I'll ask you, Malcolm, first, and then I'll give Beatrice a minute as well.
It's a really excellent question, Ian, and we almost got to the end of this session without having to make an attempt to answer it. What Will Jess and I argued in our recent paper on defence, in a situation in which the defence budget was more or less protected in real terms, was the area in which we should revise the the headline goals, the headmark goals for the UK forces would be in terms of that commitment to deploy a division in a timescale which is relevant in the European theatre or more broadly. And that it feels to me even more so that that's a commitment which we don't currently fulfill, and it's an area in which we can perhaps make some economies, focusing our ground forces in the British Army, but also in the Royal Marines, more in responding to a range of more limited crises across the European theatre. But in terms of providing bulk of ground forces, our European continental neighbours, most of all Germany, I think, need to step up to the plate. It's not something that the UK cannot do everything. So I think that'd be now whether that's enough, it will depend on what the settlement is for the MOD. And I think, as I said, slow real terms increases feels pretty optimistic for the MOD at the moment. Whether we're looking at cuts of the magnitude that we saw in 2010, I think is still up for debate. And I think that'll relate not least to the broader fiscal argument about whether the argument in favour of higher taxes prevails, despite all the objections which Jonathan quite rightly aired earlier, or whether there are no tax rises, in which case the stress on the defence budget will be much greater.
Beatrice, you talked about the constraints on the economy. What do you think needs to give way?
As I'm not an economist, I shall modestly refrain from saying something, talking through my hat here. But the one thing that I think stands out and is clear is that one needs force multipliers, one needs allies, one needs to pool resources, one needs to cooperate, and in that way make savings. And that is only possible with allies and partners on whom you can rely on, not simply fair weather friends with whom you have an ad hoc trade deal of some sorts. Thank you very much.
Excellent. All I could say is that I'm very sorry that we were not able to fit in many more questions. There are plenty of questions to be asked about this topic. Our promise is that we will return to this topic. We are meeting every week during this crisis at the same time at 2 o'clock British summertime, and I invite you all to come. Meanwhile, all remains to me is to thank Beatrice Heuser and Professor Malcolm Chalmers for their contribution, and to lament the fact that we have not answered some of the quite profound questions, including one from one of our members who asked what happens if the next integrated review is actually too obsessed by the pandemic and misses the next crisis. A good question, which I hope we will answer in the weeks to come. Thanks to the audience and thanks to the panelists, and goodbye from London.